Hello there, everyone. Meteorologist Jim Dickey here with yet another edition of Tracking the Tropics. My third of the month of May. Hurricane season isn't actually officially starting until June 1st, and yet we haven't had any storms yet in the Atlantic, but it's been somewhat eventful these past couple days, these past couple weeks. That's for sure. We had our invest in place in the Atlantic going back to earlier this week. That, of course, did not materialize, but it did help to soak Florida. And you can see on the satellite imagery here, this is water vapor, but I actually think it's infrared. Regardless, you can see sort of what's going on here. All this cloud coverage showing up, thunderstorms, heavy thunderstorms, Cuba into the Atlantic. Look out across Puerto Rico. See how the winds are moving from east to west? So broad easterly winds moving through the Caribbean, trade winds. And then note how north of New Orleans, everything's moving from north to south. And then when you get to the coast of Florida, everything's moving from south to north. So you have two big features here. You have an upper-level low-pressure system dipping into the Gulf of Mexico. You have broad high pressure in the Atlantic, forming sort of a pincer movement into Florida. So bringing all of the air together over the Florida Peninsula and dragging tropical moisture northward out of the Southwest Caribbean and sending that tropical moisture all the way up the eastern seaboard. In fact, take a look at the moisture tracker, and this is going through the weekend. So speaking to the fact this isn't going to end anytime soon, the moisture continues to be dragged in. You can see the direct connection all the way into the Southwest Caribbean going through Saturday, going through Sunday. I could run this out through next week. It would show much the same thing. That pattern is not going to break. End of note. You may have heard some chatter, let's go ahead and call it hype, on social media, that perhaps something could try to get going in that deep area of tropical moisture down there in the Southwest Caribbean. The GFS, the American model, has been keying in on this for quite some time now. But when we were looking at this last week, it was doing just absolutely absurd things. All the same, here we are as we go into Tuesday. So what's happening here is something called the Central American Gyre looks to be setting up. You have broad easterly winds coming across the Caribbean on into the Yucatan, and then when you go south of Central America, you have westerly winds. So when you look at the whole area, you have broad counterclockwise flow, cyclonic flow, and the models pick up on this, and they tend to spin up little areas of low pressure. In the case of the GFS, going back to last week, it was spitting out very strong low pressure, doing it that very quickly, deepening it way too quickly, and then moving it northward. In these scenarios, we can get an area of low pressure to form up, and it's not out of the question that this is going to happen. So watch this model as we go into Wednesday. There's your broad area of low pressure. Now it's closed off, and now this model has it moving up through Cuba. But this is a change. So if you were to look at this last week, it was showing a closed off hurricane, frankly, moving its way towards Florida. Now as we get closer in time, and generally speaking, when you look at models, as you get closer to the actual event happening, the errors don't compound as much. Things start to make a little bit more sense as far as how the actual atmosphere works. So you can take a little more, have a little more faith in this, so to say. End of note, it shows a broad, stretched out area of low pressure, working its way out of the Caribbean, towards the Florida Straits, towards the Gulf of Mexico. I don't think this is entirely out of the question. In fact, when you look at climatology for the month of June in hurricane season, this is something that is pretty typical for the month. You have typical tracks and origins on this, yellow being the areas of origin, the arrow showing you the tracks, and 1 is pretty close to the scenario that the models have been spitting out, showing something trying to come out of the Southwest Caribbean, working towards the Gulf of Mexico. You even have a little bullseye there of potential development west of the Gulf of Mexico. Now, it's May, not June. But if you live in Florida, you know we've sort of settled into our rainy season a bit early here. So it's almost like we're acting like June already. So not out of the question that we could see a June-like system take shape. But as we look at the conditions here, as this broad low tries to move its way in, they're not necessarily ideal. In fact, look at the sea surface temperatures. You're generally looking for things at 80 or above, and we're seeing temperatures mainly in the 70s, quite warm down the Caribbean. Once you get into the Gulf, because we've had so much rainfall here, so much stormy weather, sort of churning things up, temperatures in the 70s. The Atlantic, especially when you get away from the Gulf Stream, mid and even lower 70s. And also, this same pattern, that little dip in the upper level flow, that upper level low pressure system that's helping to drag this low pressure and this tropical moisture into the Gulf of Mexico, is also going to act to sort of shear it apart. This is the same model, the GFS. I'm showing you the mean wind shear, and you can see there that deep red area where I have the arrow pointed. That is very strong shear in the vicinity of Cuba as it lifts its way in. If a tropical system tries to get going in that, it's going to be completely torn apart. So when I see the scenario, the first storm I thought of, and typically it's a good idea to take a look at history and think of what storms have occurred in this sort of pattern. The first storm that came to mind was back in 2016, Tropical Storm Colin. You probably don't remember it because it didn't have a huge impact. This is what the storm looked like, as it was a tropical storm. Early June 2016, it was, I mean, by all accounts, a sheared out mess. So that's what I'm expecting. If we do get anything tropical from this, it'll probably be ragged, perhaps even subtropical, a hybrid type storm, a stretched out low that maybe has a tropical core in there. But all the same, it was a big rain producer for portions of Florida. This is the track it took going through, again, early June. It moved its way into the Big Bend of Florida, but we do have, you see the maximum rainfall there, over 17 inches of rain. So that's what I want you to be focusing on when you see these things on social media. I don't know why this is zooming out. I'm going to stop it from zooming out because that looks silly. But the rainfall. We're going to have rain all weekend long. We're going to keep the chances for rainfall in place through next week. And then this thing comes out of the Caribbean and moves its way towards Florida and brings an additional chance for some significant rainfall. This is the same GFS model. This is showing total rainfall all the way through Memorial Day, so 2 Mondays from now, and it's showing the potential for a foot of rain in that time across the Florida Straits, where it's currently taking that low. So the point here is, as we go forward in time here, what we're going to watch is for the potential for widespread, heavy, potentially flooding rainfall. So here's your takeaways. This rainy pattern, regardless of whatever goes on next week, is going to continue through the weekend, through next week, into next weekend. Regardless of any type of development, that moisture is still going to be rolling its way into Florida, and we're still going to have the chance for some significant rainfall here. We are going to watch the Southwest Caribbean and the Gulf of Mexico, the potential for some tropical development. I think the idea, if you start to see people putting out models on social media these next couple of days of a big monster-type storm, I think the idea that something like that could come together, I don't really buy it. The waters aren't quite warm enough just yet. There's going to be way too much shear as whatever low tries to get going moves its way in here. But there's definitely a threat for some flooding in South Florida, which is kind of interesting, ironic perhaps to think of, as we're currently in drought. So that would definitely bust the drought and perhaps even send us the other way. So we'll definitely be keeping an eye on this as we head through next week. We'll have updates throughout the weekend, and I'll be back early next week with a fresh look on what's going on. So keep with us here at ABC7 on air and online as we continue to track this potential tropical rainmaker here for Southwest Florida. Again, timing-wise, we're talking still a week plus out next weekend, the Memorial Day weekend, that this could be a threat for some heavy rain. All right, until then, meteorologist Jim Dickey. Have a great weekend.